The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm orange hue over the desert. Emily stood at the edge of a small military outpost, its steel structures glinting in the fading light. Dust swirled around her feet as the sound of heavy trucks and the hum of helicopters filled the air. She hadn't expected to find herself here, but fate had a way of pulling her toward places she never thought she'd go. Her palms were sweaty as she clutched the crumpled $20 bill in her hand. It wasn't much, not enough to make a real difference, but it was all she had. All she could offer. A soldier, rugged and lean, approached her, his heavy boots crunching on the dirt beneath him. He was taller than she had expected, with a rough stubble on his face and eyes that spoke of battles fought in silence. His uniform was faded from weeks of wear, but it didn't hide the strength in his frame or the exhaustion in his gaze. "You need something?" he asked, his voice low and distant, like he was used to dealing with the harsh realities of life. Emily took a deep breath. She hesitated. "I just wanted to help." "Take it. Please." She extended the $20 toward him. The soldier stared at it, as if the bill was some alien object he couldn't quite comprehend. His brow furrowed, and for a moment, he simply stood there. "I don't need charity," he said, his tone rougher than before. "You don't have to do this." "I'm not giving it to you because I pity you," Emily replied, her voice firm. "I'm giving it to you because you're fighting a war, and I don't have much to offer, but I know this might help." The soldier's eyes softened ever so slightly. He looked down at her extended hand, then back into her eyes. There was something in her gaze that made him pause, an understanding he wasn't used to receiving. "You're giving me your last $20? He asked, still unsure. "Why?" "Because you're out there every day," she said, almost to herself. "And I'm not. I just want to do something, anything, to make a difference." The soldier looked down at the bill again, the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. Slowly, he reached forward and took it. His grip was firm, as though he was grasping something much heavier than money. "Thanks," he muttered. "But you don't know what you're getting yourself into." "Maybe I don't," Emily said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But I can't stand by and do nothing." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the desert wind stirring the dust between them. The soldier finally gave a stiff nod, tucking the $20 into his pocket, then turned to leave. As he walked away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. She had no idea why she had chosen to give him that money, she hadn't even known his name at the time. But something about him had resonated with her, and she could only hope that small act of kindness would make a difference. Days turned into weeks. Emily tried to push the memory of that encounter to the back of her mind, but it lingered. She returned to her life, her job at a small cafe, her quiet apartment, but the world outside seemed increasingly chaotic. News reports flooded her screens: military conflict, drone strikes, soldiers on the move. But amid it all, there was a piece of her that still felt the weight of that soldier's eyes on her, as though something had shifted in that brief exchange. Then, one morning, as Emily was sipping coffee at her kitchen table, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Emily? It's Jackson. We need to talk. Prepare yourself." Her hand froze mid-sip, the cup nearly slipping from her grasp. Jackson. The soldier. The man she had given her last $20 to. "We're coming for you." The words were short, cryptic, and sent a chill racing down her spine. What did he mean? Why was he reaching out to her now? Emily stood up, her knees weak. She glanced out the window, as if expecting to see something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing, just the quiet streets of her neighborhood, the hum of distant cars, the normalcy of a life she no longer felt connected to. Her thoughts raced. Had she unknowingly become involved in something larger than herself? Or was this simply a coincidence? As the seconds passed, Emily's breath grew shallow. The message had shaken her to her core, and yet she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something far bigger than a simple soldier's gratitude was at play. With trembling fingers, she typed a response. "What's going on?" The reply came almost instantly. It's time to finish what you started. The fight's not over. Emily couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones. She stared at the message from Jackson again, her thumb hovering over the screen. The fight's not over. What did that even mean? Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why had Jackson reached out to her after all this time? And why was she involved in something she hadn't signed up for? She had given him $20, nothing more. That was all. Yet here she was, caught in a web of uncertainty, her quiet life now shattered. She dropped the phone on the table, her hands trembling. She had to get answers. She couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. With a deep breath, she stood up and grabbed her coat. The city streets outside her apartment were buzzing with the normal hum of daily life, commuters rushing to work, cars honking, and the occasional street vendor selling their goods. Everything seemed normal. Yet for Emily, it felt like the world had tilted sideways. She walked briskly to the bus stop, her thoughts swirling with confusion and fear. What had she gotten herself into? Jackson's message had unsettled her, but the words "the fight's not over" repeated in her mind, refusing to be silenced. She boarded the bus, her eyes darting nervously across the passengers. Was she being followed? Was someone watching her? She shook the thought away. She was overthinking this. Or was she? As the bus rattled toward the outskirts of the city, Emily's phone buzzed again. This time, a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She answered. "Emily?" The voice on the other end was deep, rough, and familiar. "Jackson?" Her heart skipped. "What's going on? What do you mean the fight's not over?" There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You've been involved since the moment you gave me that money. You didn't know it, but that $20 was a signal. It's connected to something bigger, something you don't fully understand." A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She had a million questions, but no way to ask them fast enough. "What do you mean by something bigger? What's this all about?" Jackson's voice lowered, as though he was checking to make sure no one was listening. "There's a group we've been tracking for years, an enemy that has been hiding in plain sight. They've been pulling strings, orchestrating conflicts, and manipulating events. We didn't realize how far their reach was until recently. And now, they've found you." Emily's breath caught. "Found me? What do you mean? I haven't done anything wrong." "You didn't have to," Jackson replied, his tone cold. "You've just become part of the equation. The moment you helped me, you became a target. They've been watching you." Fear gripped her heart. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. "I don't understand. What do they want from me?" There was a pause, then Jackson spoke again, this time with urgency. "I don't have time to explain everything over the phone. But I'm coming for you. You need to be ready." Emily's mind spun as she tried to process what he was saying. Her normal life was gone. In its place was a strange and terrifying reality, one where she was involved in a conspiracy she never asked for. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay where you are. I'll be there soon." The line went dead. Emily sat back in her seat, her head pounding. The bus continued its route, but the city outside felt like it was no longer her home. She was a pawn in someone else's game, and she didn't know how to escape. When the bus arrived at her stop, Emily didn't hesitate. She stepped off the curb, her eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of Jackson or anyone who might be watching. But there was nothing. The world seemed as indifferent as ever. She quickened her pace, heading down a narrow side street. It was quieter here, the bustle of the city fading away as she moved deeper into the maze of alleyways. She needed to think, to figure out what was happening, but every time she tried to focus, her mind spiraled into panic. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but it was only a man passing by. He glanced at her, but but didn't seem to notice the fear in her eyes. She let out a shaky breath and kept walking. As she rounded the corner of the street, she saw him. Jackson. He was standing at the entrance to an alleyway, his figure looming in the dim light. The instant he saw her, his posture stiffened, and he started walking toward her with purposeful strides. Emily's pulse quickened as she approached him. "Jackson?" she asked, her voice tight. He nodded, his eyes scanning the street behind her before he looked at her again. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "Then tell me what's going on," she demanded, her voice shaking. "Tell me what I've gotten myself into." Jackson's expression softened, but there was no comfort in it. "You've been marked. And the worst part is, they're closer than you think." Emily's heart hammered in her chest as Jackson led her deeper into the shadowed alley, the dim light from the street lamps casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The air was thick with tension, and despite the chill creeping through her coat, she felt too warm, too on edge. "Jackson, I don't understand. You're telling me I'm a target now? Because I gave you some money?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cracked with disbelief. Jackson didn't answer right away. He moved like a man who knew exactly where he was going, his eyes darting around the alley as if searching for danger. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, urgent. "It's not about the money, Emily. It never was. That was just the beginning. You've been marked, and the people behind this, they're smart. They've been watching you long before I ever walked into your life." Emily stopped in her tracks, her feet rooted to the cold ground beneath her. "Why me? Why am I involved in something like this?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jackson paused and turned to face her, his eyes darkened by the weight of whatever knowledge he carried. "Because you're connected to something much bigger than yourself. You don't know it, but your family, your blood, has ties to a secret group that's been in the shadows for years. I've spent most of my life tracking them, but now that they know you're involved, they won't stop." She felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. "My family." Her mind raced to every family history story she'd ever heard, tales of hard work and humble beginnings. Nothing seemed connected to whatever he was saying. "Yes. There's more to your story than you know." "Much more," Jackson continued, his voice grim. "They've been keeping track of anyone connected to your family line for years. When you helped me, you unknowingly triggered a chain reaction." Emily tried to absorb what he was saying, but it felt like too much. "So what now? How do we stop them?" Jackson's gaze softened for a moment, but it was fleeting. "We don't stop them. Not yet, at least. We just survive long enough to learn what we're up against." Emily's stomach twisted into knots. "What does that even mean?" Before Jackson could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. They both turned in unison, instinctively moving closer to the shadowed wall of the alley. A man appeared, walking casually, his hands in his pockets. He didn't seem to notice them at first, but his eyes quickly darted to Jackson. "Here to deliver the message?" Jackson's tone was sharp, his hand instinctively reaching for something beneath his jacket. The man nodded, his lips curling into a tight smile. "It's time to come with us, Jackson. The game's over." Emily's pulse spiked, and for the first time, she felt the real weight of danger. She wasn't just a bystander anymore, she was in the middle of something that could cost her everything. "I think you're mistaken," Jackson said, his voice colder now. "I'm not going anywhere." The man chuckled softly, and before Emily could react, the atmosphere shifted. The man's calm demeanor faltered as he pulled something from his jacket, a sleek black pistol, glinting under the faint streetlight. Jackson moved before Emily could process the situation, his body a blur as he disarmed the man in a single fluid motion. The gun clattered to the ground, and Jackson slammed the man against the wall with brutal efficiency. "Tell your people to back off," Jackson growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not playing by their rules anymore." The man didn't resist, his face turning pale. "You don't get it, Jackson. This isn't about rules. This is about control. They've been watching you. And they know you're getting too close." Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen this side of Jackson, never imagined that beneath the weary soldier was a man capable of such cold, precise violence. The realization hit her like a freight train. Jackson wasn't just a soldier. He was a man shaped by forces far darker than she could comprehend. The man's voice trembled. "You can't run from them forever. You've already crossed a line." Jackson's grip tightened. "I'm not running. But I'll make sure no one else gets hurt because of my past." With a final shove, Jackson released the man, who staggered backward, clutching his ribs. "Leave. And tell them if they come for me again, it won't end this way." The man didn't say another word. He turned and fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had come. Emily felt the air around her shift back to stillness, the adrenaline rushing through her veins. Her mind was reeling, the weight of Jackson's actions sinking in. She had just witnessed something dark and dangerous, and for the first time, she realized the gravity of what she had stepped into. Jackson turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded slowly, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "I think I'm more scared now than I've ever been." Jackson's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I didn't want you involved in this, Emily. I never should have let you help me. But now it's too late." She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "What happens now?" "We move," Jackson said, his voice steady, yet resolute. "And we figure out who's pulling the strings. The fight's just beginning." The night felt heavier than before, the air thick with the scent of rain and the weight of uncertainty pressing down on Emily's chest. She and Jackson had retreated to a safe house, hidden in the heart of the city's industrial district. The building was old, its walls thick with years of history, but it offered the shelter they needed. Jackson's voice had been steady, but his eyes, those eyes, hadn't fooled her. He was more than just on edge. Something was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. "I don't get it," Emily said, pacing the narrow room, her fingers running through her hair. "How could they have been watching me for so long? My family, they're just ordinary people." Jackson sat at the small table, his eyes scanning the documents spread before him, maps, photos, and intelligence reports that didn't make sense. But to him, they were the pieces of a puzzle he had been piecing together for years. He looked up at her, his gaze piercing, but weary. "Ordinary people don't get watched unless they've got something to hide," he said, his voice soft but hard with experience. "Your family is tied to something more than you realize. This group, this enemy, they don't miss details. They've been following you." "But why me? Why now?" Emily asked, her voice rising. She felt a surge of frustration, the truth slipping just out of her grasp. The night had become a blur of confusion and fear. She was drowning in questions, but Jackson wasn't ready to give answers. "Because they think you're the key," he said, his voice grim. "And they'll do anything to get what they want." Emily stopped pacing, her feet rooted to the floor. "The key to what? What could I possibly have that they want?" She wanted answers, but she feared what they might reveal. She didn't want to know. Yet she had to. Jackson hesitated. His gaze flickered to the wall before he stood and moved toward the window. The night outside was eerily silent. "It's a weapon. One your family's been guarding for generations. They've kept it hidden for years, and now, they've figured out where it is." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. "A weapon? What kind of weapon?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't read. "Not just any weapon. This one can change everything. If they get their hands on it, it's over." Emily's mind raced. Her family, her quiet, unassuming family, was tied to something so dangerous, so explosive that it could destroy everything she had ever known. She felt the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't about money or politics. This was about power, the kind of power that could bend the world to its will. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small but determined. "We stop them before they find it," Jackson said, his voice resolute. He moved toward the table, sorting through the papers with practiced ease. We don't have much time. We need to find the weapon before they do. If they get their hands on it, his words trailed off as he glanced at her. She saw the fear behind his mask, and it made her stomach turn. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of the decision crashing down on her. She had no idea how to find this weapon or even what it looked like. But she did know one thing: Jackson was right. If they didn't stop it, everything she cared about would be lost. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just an innocent bystander. She was part of this war now, whether she liked it or not. "Where do we start?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Jackson met her eyes, his expression softer now, almost like he was seeing her for the first time. "We start by finding the people who know about it. And then we make sure they can't tell anyone else." "Who are these people?" Emily asked, her mind spinning with the possibilities. Who else could be involved in this? They're part of a larger organization. Powerful people who don't want to be found. They've been operating in the shadows for years, pulling the strings behind every major conflict. Jackson's jaw tightened as he spoke. But they made a mistake. They thought they could control this weapon. They didn't count on you. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "Me?" Jackson's lips curled into a half-smile, but there was no humor in it. "You're the key, Emily. You just don't know it yet." A sudden knock on the door jolted them both from their thoughts. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Jackson moved silently, his hand on the grip of the gun tucked beneath his jacket. He motioned for her to stay back as he approached the door, his movements fluid and cautious. Through the crack in the door, a shadow passed. Jackson's voice was low, steady. "Who is it?" A voice on the other side answered, just loud enough for Emily to hear. "We've got a problem." Jackson's eyes locked with Emily's. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need to ask what kind of problem. It was here. Whatever had been lurking in the shadows was finally moving. Jackson turned back toward her. "Stay close," he ordered. "It's time to go." Emily's heart raced, her every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to hide anymore. Whatever came next, they would face it together. She followed him as he opened the door, her breath steady but quick, bracing for whatever lay ahead.